There's nothing worse than sitting down super inspired to make music, only to end up going through thousands of terrible sounds and presets that make you want to end it all. Instead of getting hard trap snares and earth-shattering 808s, you're left with getting a bunch of booty claps and basses that sound like wet farts. There has to be an easier way to do this, and there is. Sound selection. But what makes the sound actually good or not? And honestly, this is a very subjective thing, so I've split it up into 4 different categories that I kind of base my sound selection off of. The first one being sonics, or just how it sounds. One of the most important aspects is timbre, which is basically the characteristic of that sound. And it's basically the reason why, even though you have 2 different violin sounds, they sound different from each other. So in this first sample, you can hear that it's bright, aggressive, and drier than your Instagram DMs right now. For the second sample, it's a lot darker, mellower, and it has a lot of reflections because of the room that it's recorded in. Each of them have a different set of harmonics and partials that give it the certain characteristics that make it sound different. So even though it's 2 different violins, they might be different styles of violins, different sizes, made out of different materials. You might be using different strings, recorded in different rooms with different microphones, or going through different preamps. There's many different variables that kind of result in a different sound in the end, especially when it comes to like post-processing and stuff like that. So it's kind of important to understand all the different aspects that are involved. The second most important part of sonics is the overall dynamics of the sound, and that's basically just how the volume changes over time and like the overall transient information involved. And some sounds are very compressed and don't have a lot of dynamics, while others are very dynamic and aren't compressed at all. Let's use a couple snares as an example. This first sample has a decent timbre, but overall the transient information in it is really lacking, and there isn't really any fundamental tone in the lower mid-range. The second snare is kind of like the opposite, where it has really great transient information, but there's no characteristic or timbre that really makes it set itself apart. This is where I find layering to be really useful, because you can take sounds with 2 different attributes and you can combine them together to create something even better. So after layering those sounds together and doing a bit of minor tweaking, this is what I came up with. And as you can hear from the end result, it retains the transient information from the second snare, while also having the characteristics from the first snare. And these might sound like subtle changes, but they actually make a drastic difference in the end result of the beat. The second most important aspect of picking a sound is to choose the genre or the style that it's in. But I really do recommend that you get in the habit of studying different genres and understanding the tendencies and the history behind everything so you can better emulate those sounds. Like for example, with trap music, most people know that it was derived from the drum machine, the TR-808 by Roland. Whereas genres like house music actually derived from the TR-909. Or if you think about like pop music, you can trace it back to like Lindrum and Yamaha and a lot of different old drum machines that basically just made those sounds. So by having a better understanding of the background of the music, you can start making more conscious decisions on the sounds that you choose to directly influence that. Here's a loop from my friend Aiden Hahn. Now, when I first heard the sample, I immediately thought like pop radio, summer beach, rubbing suntan lotion all over your girl's booty cheeks type beat.
What?
I wanted it to have a pop sound with supporting live drum elements. And since I wanted it to be primarily pop, I made the decision to have the kick and the snare to be primarily pop influenced, because those are the most important elements within the mix. I chose this kick and this snare because they were clean, bright, full, and they had very clicky transients in the beginning. To reinforce these 2 elements, I added a reverb/reverse reverb at the end of claps to kind of give it more movement. Outside of those drum elements, I pretty much made sure that I wanted everything else to have a live drum set characteristic to it. So I added a ghost snare between the main claps. I also layered 2 hi-hats together to add a more realistic shuffle. And lastly, I added a drum fill into an Ableton sampler, and I sliced it up and made my own pattern with it. And I basically set it up so that it always plays at the end of like a chorus or a verse to transition into the next section. Then I used the VST Moto bass to give myself a live bass guitar sound, because I wanted it to complement the original loop that Aiden made. Instead of having the bass guitar start on the 1 like it usually does, I thought it would be a little more convincing or realistic if I added an octave bass slide at the beginning to transition into the chorus. And if you thought that was it, then you're a stupid idiot, because I added a whoosh effect sound, I added a white noise riser, and I also added some environment background noise of a public park to kind of make it sound a little bit more realistic. A lot of these subtle elements are actually more felt than noticed, but I feel like it helps paint the picture a little bit better for the listener. Now this beat was a little more straightforward, but you can actually get a little more nuance with it and you can actually mix genres together. For example, if I wanted a Chicago drill melody mixed with like UK garage drums and also a little bit of like Jersey club, I could do that. And I would basically just try to make sure that whenever I'm picking out sounds that I'm picking things within the right sound palette. You can also even mix multiple styles within a single arrangement and then alternate between them using different A-B sections if you wanted to. Like this loop, for example, I started with a MIDI from my boy Fekany and it was titled Sky Kingdom. And I basically used the title to influence the sounds that I pick for the loop. So when I thought of sky, I immediately thought of like airy, bright, super ethereal, kind of like spacey sounds. And then when I thought of kingdom, I thought of this like royalty, right? Where it's like orchestral and it sounds very live and organic sounding. So that's basically what I did. For the first section, I had it as like an orchestral sound. I used the upright piano from Ableton Live, and I also complemented it with a lead melody from a violin. For the next section, I basically take the same chord information and melodies, and I just change out the sounds for things that fit better with that style. I wanted it to feel like you ascended or something, or that you're weightless, almost as if you were like playing like Legend of Zelda or some shit. So for the chord information, I just used a pluck sound and I basically just changed the cadence of the chords so it's a little more rhythmic. And I'm not really doing anything too fancy with it. The only thing that is kind of cool that I did was I used a disperser to give it this more like watery type characteristic. After that, I basically just changed the violin and I kept the same melody, but then I used a ambient virtual pad kind of sound that replaced it instead. I sang this little melody cadence that I thought sounded cool and I drowned it out with reverb and added a bit of filtering. And then I added this very bouncy synthy type of lead that has like a little bit of glide or portamento on it, just to make it a little more fun sounding. And lastly, for the textures, I used a few layers. I added this really luscious soundscape in the background, and I basically just did a sidechain pumping effect with LFO tool to kind of give it a little more movement. And then I resampled some of the elements within the loop and I ran it through Output Portal, and I came up with this really cool texture / cadence that I thought matched the loop really well. And lastly, I just added some more environment noise because I feel like it just kind of adds a little bit of more authenticity. It makes it sound flawed. And this is the end result. The third aspect of sound selection is to understand the context. And I think it's really important to understand that just because the sound is good doesn't mean that it fits in every single context. I really like to take into account the surrounding elements when it comes to like actually picking new sounds, because that directly influences what I pick. I find that either it's really good to pick complementary sounds or contrasting sounds. And you can do this in one of two ways, through dynamics, timbre, or both. For example, if you were working with a soft mellow pad and you were looking to have a contrasting element, you could have something like a pluck, which is kind of like the opposite from a pad in terms of like ADSR. Or you could even reach for something like an aggressive or an abrasive lead to contrast the mellow pad. For complementary elements, it's as easy as picking sounds that are already similar sonically. And lastly, I would take into account personal taste. Now this is something that really develops over time, and it's really important to pick your influences when it comes to stuff like this. For example, one of your favorite producers is Benny X, and you might be using two different styles of basses. One that's like a resonant plucky bass, and then the other might be a typical 808. Or if you like Wonder Girl, you might be using different percussion as opposed to like Boy Wonder or something like that. And I found that by having a very diverse amount of influences, I can pick from different styles and choose what best fits that beat in that moment. Another thing to note is that a good sound will not always coincide with your own preferences. So sometimes I actually choose sounds that I wouldn't necessarily pick in other circumstances, but it's because it fits with everything else in that context. I really recommend that you challenge your own biases and pick sounds that you wouldn't normally pick sometimes. Now, I actually found it super helpful to build my own personal stash of sounds. And this is great for two reasons. The first one being is that it actually speeds up your workflow because you're actually not going through a whole bunch of different kits to find a whole bunch of different sounds, and it's all in one folder. The second reason is that it actually helps you train your ears, because if I'm going through like gigabytes of sounds, I'm able to better discern like what sounds are better than others based off of comparing them to each other. There's really three categories that I kind of like base my sound selection off of. The first one is being like melodic stuff. So this is related to compositional elements usually. It has a lot of tonality typically, and yeah, it's very just melodic. The second is percussive. So this is all the rhythmic based stuff. I know compositional stuff can actually go into rhythm as well, but typically this is usually the atonal stuff that doesn't have a very discerned pitch a lot of times. And then there's also like sound effects and stuff like that. And this is like ear candy and all the miscellaneous stuff that doesn't really fit in any other category. There's stuff like environment sounds and transitional effects, and the list goes on, but you kind of get the idea. A couple things to mention before I end off the video. The first one being is to learn how to use your effects. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the time to go through every single effect in this video because of watch time, but just take a mental note of how it affects the incoming signal whenever you add in a certain effect, and also take into account the order in which you put those effects because it'll make a drastic difference in the end result. The second thing I would like to bring up is to make sure that not only you're picking the right sounds, but you're putting them in the right place within the frequency spectrum. I'm not saying that you can't like layer two sounds within the same sort of frequency. All I'm saying is that a part of what makes a full mix sound full is that there's room for every single thing within the mix and that everything has its space. So yeah, hopefully you got a couple things out of this. Thanks for watching.